This lecture is called Make the Testing Checklist Great Again, Handling Test Documentation. And few words about Natalia, ex-accountant and QA with almost 5 years of experience, likes having things balanced, both in private and professional life, passionate about neatly designed processes, friends, and the perfume industry. So once again, huge applause to Natalia.
Thanks for, spoiler alert. So as you already heard, hello everyone once again, I'm Natalia. And as it was also mentioned, I'm in IT and I'm working as a QA for like 5± years. And up to date actually, and during my career, I had the chance to work with different types of projects. I was a part of a team that was responsible for content moderation, sort of internal tool. I also was on a temporary period of time supporting mobile teams. I was working with employee onboarding, not only as an accountant when I was calculating taxes, all of those stuff, but also in a project that was responsible for global payroll integration, let's say. I also had some stuff with subscriptions, so all those payments, forms, funnels, etc. Payroll calculations, both in accountancy and in IT. And also for the last 4 months, I'm part of a project which is responsible for a tool that should help you with retirement advisory in general, so you can calculate how much money you will have, assuming you will save some stuff during your work career. And if someone asks what's the one issue that connects all of those, I would indicate only one, and that would be documentation. To simplify a bit what I mean by that, and actually what's wrong with documentation in general, let's have 2 border scenarios. First one, situation when we have no documentation at all. Already heard about that during those lectures today. What I mean here is no proper JIRA description for the tickets, no enough documentation on Confluence about the project, no API docs, sometimes it's happening, or mess or no info what actually we should do. You can add here whatever you want. On the other side, we have situations, surprisingly, when we have stuff that are over-documented, and actually that's something that also may happen. And usually, I think we try somehow balance between all of those. When I joined the very first project, those 5 years ago, it was a department of QA in one of product company, where we were responsible for defining processes that should be later applied to product teams within the company. And I also was supporting various teams depending on their requests, on their needs. So I was trying somehow to, again, find a balance and address situation most common having no documentation at the time. But before finding a solution for that problem that I have described, I needed to answer to myself what actually is the thing that I want to achieve. What's my goal here? And I wanted 3 things. First, again, finding the balance. What's the documentation that it's good enough, that's enough of documentation prepared. Then I wanted somehow engage the team. By engagement, I mean engaging others into writing documentation, but at the same time somehow showing them what I do as a QA, why I'm actually just jumping into some teams and proposing different stuff like, oh, you need to write documentation right now. And also break the silos. It's like the star here, because I think that when we have a situation when there is no documentation and the company is like existing for a long time already, it usually, based at least from what I have seen, connects with knowledge silos. So we have plenty of people that are already for years within that project. They know everything like the back of their hands, and they don't need to worry about writing documentation because already they know everything what's happening underneath, which was not good for someone who was like a new joiner at that time. So as usual, and with the majority of stuff, I wanted to try with some baby steps. And when I got my very first epic that was divided into smaller tickets, I created initial template for testing, like sort of testing checklist that I was using. As you can see, we have checks, status, and nodes. Checks was basically connected to acceptance criteria and stuff that I wanted to verify. Statuses, I decided to try with 3. Passed when everything was okay. Yellow warning for stuff that were not exactly bugs, but rather some potential improvements that would be good to consider when further developing the project. Something has been skipped within the requirements, whatever. And red warnings for bugs, like clear stuff that were not okay. Notes column was supposed to be a place when we can clarify what's missing. We can add some additional, I don't know, comments, maybe some confirmation whether, okay, I designed sort of a checks, but later developer realized before passing ticket further that that's not possible for some reason. And that was the very initial state, but actually it changed over time and workflows that I have been working with. I stayed with checks, but you can notice that I divided it into smaller pieces. So the first 2 rows were connected simply to acceptance criteria and making sure that the ticket meets the requirements. And those 3 other stuff are something that I would say it depends, as usual in our job, but design overview or mobile web overview, that was rather a signal for me when I was testing something, that, okay, I should take an additional look on some designs, not to forget, because it may affect the whole flow, or make sure that it's unified across the application. Mobile web, again, we may have desktop applications, but sometimes it would be good to double check mobile web view whether it's responsive or not, especially when we are introducing some new form, new page, whatever. And exploration, it roughly says that workflow should work with no issues. Again, that's a reminder for me that I always should have in mind the bigger picture. So even you have design checks, don't forget about this fun that you can have and make from testing when playing around with the product you are actually developing. I added also expected results because I realized that when using checks and addressing, okay, verify ABC if something, it's pretty tough to follow and to actually say explicitly whether it's passed or not necessarily. Yeah, node stays the same, statuses as well. So actually that's the latest version of the template that I'm using in the project that I'm working with. And where you can create such checklist? Well, again, it depends. I started from comments, but like from the time perspective, it's not the best place, I would say, because you as a author of a comment, you are the only person who can edit and add new inputs to that. So the idea of engaging developers, PO, business design, whatever, actually wouldn't work here because you need to add over and over again new version. But also you can use description, you can have some dedicated space in Notion and Confluence, whatever tool you use. Basically, it doesn't matter that much where you will put your checklist as long as it fits your needs. Currently, we are actually using description of a ticket, but how we ended up with that, I will tell you in a sec. So in general, using checklists, in our case, in my case, as a like QA on a daily basis, and also like from the team's perspective, gave us a lot, I must say. First thing that was pretty valuable was time. It's creating checklists in table form. It's much faster than creating regular test cases. When we had this situation that we had lots of like documented stuff. We had, I don't even remember how many exactly. We have test cases written in a classic way, some of it given when then, trying to introduce BDD. It was a mess, and it was really hard to get the essence, what actually should we do with that. Apart from that, thanks to using checklist currently, we have knowledge, basically. So it's the same that when you are creating cheat sheets on your studies or at school. When you have to think about what actually should be checked, even if you are like brand new in a project, you automatically learning how the application works or how it should work. It allows building cooperation. The idea, as I said, was to engage POs and developers at that time to verify whether my checks are correct and whether my understanding of the requirements is correct, but also like catching those gaps and misunderstanding earlier than later. So on the design of checklist level, instead of once I tested something, reported an issue, and it turned out that, okay, but that's not an issue actually because we have changed the requirements. And again, that's the next point here. Using checklists also helped a lot with tracking context switching. So both when I was working as an accountant and even I was not creating tables with expected result, I had to work with a bunch of smaller and bigger companies. So I had to be aware that each company has those tiny nuances that you need to follow and be aware of. Same with temporary support for various product teams. You may work within the one application when it comes to like product team, but all team has their own specifics that you should be aware of. And simply having such checklist is an insurance and saved my skin tons of times. Yeah, and what can I say? If you have a checklist with nice explanation on what went nice and what was wrong, what has been tested, what's not, you can have a backup, or it's a bad word in Polish how to say it, but anyway, you can have a backup for a situation when someone tries to play a blame game. But before we ended up in this level, as usual in our jobs, something went wrong. And what was it actually? As with everything, checklist can be overused. That's the example of a checklist that actually existed, and unfortunately, I must admit, I designed that initially. I was working at the time with this payroll company, and we were trying to build an integration of sort of HR system to our platform that would allow sending payroll calculations from our platform. So no accountancy, no staff needed, all salary changes, employee statuses, everything is in one place. And the thing was to, as with employees, you have tons of employees in one system that you need to somehow map to our one. And yeah, handle that, considering that there will be more HR system that we want to incorporate into our possibilities. So I designed such checks, and here you have only 2 rows with what had happened, but actually there was like plenty of checks to perform. And the whole integration took few iterations of testing, and as you can see, first we have stuff that were like broken even after a few times, but the biggest problem that was at the time with such checklist, it's very hard to follow what actually went wrong. Even though we have points here, if you need to like quickly check what's the status of particular check and where we are with such requirements, it's pretty hard because each time you need to follow the list. And imagine that, again, you have much more checks overall, and at some point that checklist was hard to follow even on a bigger screen. So I do not recommend, and I'm still like, I'm in pain when watching this, but yeah. Another example of stuff that I would not recommend when it comes to creating testing checklists is overuse of extras that you can add to text edition in general. Here's the example of Jira and Confluence, like basically those test editors. So we have info panels in Jira, but imagine that you have a table with couple of rows and columns, and each cell within that has their own info panel, and apart from that, text inside in those info panels has some bold, some underlines, some whatever you call it. And that's not actually my example, but I met that few times in places where we had stuff over documented. So again, when you got a checklist, even it looks nice, it's colorful, very pretty, again, it's very hard to get the essence, but what's the status? We tested it or not? How does it work? Yet another problem with creating checklists and placing documentation in general is having multiple places for that and doing them in not unified approach. This is again the checklist that you have already seen, but when we were implementing and went live with those integration of payroll system, and some like people changed, I was off, whatever, we additionally have extra Google Doc page with some lists of issues, checks, statuses, etc., and some bugs randomly listed in Excel. That was a nightmare, basically, to, again, find the information, what's the quality of the product, how to assess at which state we are. And apart from that, again, please don't do that. Like when you are creating documentation, make sure it's clean. You can choose Google Docs if you wish and it works for you, but if you once choose that way, try to stick with that for further issues as well. And a bit of everything. I realized that when I create checklists under time pressure, I tend to create happy path driven ones. So I forget about adding extra scenarios, extra point of verification that would be valuable and important to check within that. That's why I actually added to my latest version of checklist this exploration model and some extra rows that sometimes I check, sometimes not. I also realized that sometimes I was skipping important parts for an API, especially for an API. When I had to check stuff separately for backend and frontend, and when planning or designing checks for that, I was forgetting about like checking how they should be, like how they should work when merged once we have both tickets ready. That was when I was pretty new in general for an API, part of onboarding and lessons learned. But again, when designing checks to your tickets, try to have bigger picture in your mind. Another problem that we met in a team where we all people, where not everyone likes those tables, not everyone like filling them in. And that was one of the hardest stuff to push, I would say. What I recommend here for addressing such issue is try to sell this idea and make it a common effort. If you work on defining, on proposing some solution, instead of coming and, okay, from now on and starting from tomorrow, we are doing in my way. Instead of, if you sell something to your team and try to convince them that may get some benefits from that, it would be much easier to introduce those solutions. But sometimes it won't work, and at that point I simply try to use authority of manager, of QA team lead. So simply asking people who have power to help me here. And sorry, yet another problem, when creating checklists, sometimes there is lack of time to have it prepared in advance. So the idea of creating those tables was to go like more into left, then start like thinking about scenarios when testing, which was at some point like an issue when I was joining projects that I didn't have experience with, and already was someone there. What can be done in general, and what we have done, like me as like when designing it, and also when defining the process. First, order matters. I realized that when creating checks, instead of going through acceptance criteria randomly, which are sometimes not super well designed, and those requirements are like flying around, instead of creating checklists in the same way, try to start from simple positives, then negatives, and then go into complex ones. Maybe that's not the ideal solution, but I realized that when I use this order and I have it similar for almost every ticket that I create, it stays clean. And it's much safer for the features, especially that may be risky among your product. But as always, always have in mind bigger picture. Don't forget about some extras. Don't stick only to those checks that you have, even though you have designed them. If something new comes to your mind once you start testing, add it. That's nothing bad. It's not like written in stone. It's something that should be useful for us, not just created for the art's sake. Another issue or another thing that I would recommend doing when creating checklists, no matter if it's something for testing purposes only, but also when you are creating documentation for your daily to-do list, for test plan, whatever, make it maintainable. When creating checklist per ticket, usually it's maybe one-time solution. So you create checklist for ticket, test it, move to done, and forget about that. Instead of like repetitive work that cannot be reused, try to prepare sort of regression checklists separately. Currently, I use the Confluence page and I have checks there, but inspired by podcast Poszkolenie I Potestowanie, and that's not paid promotion, I decided to test the solution there. So instead of like going through Confluence, I plan to create checklists, but in Excel for regression. So you have like sort of one-line scenarios that you can adjust to your needs. So add statuses if you wish. You can then extend tests that you need. You don't need to spend too much time on editing that, and you can easily get also some metrics, some data, dashboard, whatever you need in your project. When creating checklists, both for those one times and also when adjusting the automation checklist, this regression, not automation, think about automation when doing it. Again, we try, when creating documentation, try to think holistically about tests that you need to perform. If there is something that requires automation, add it to your checklist, add it as an info to developer, not to forget about that later. If you have regression checklist and it's not fully ready, you don't have like time for automation, you can also use it as priorities, what should be automated, etc. Like the idea of using checks is having something clear and concrete enough that you can easily like scan if you wish, but also easily reuse for the future. Another thing, not to have stuff that are one-time used. You can always link similar components or add tickets relations. If there is something that, okay, I remember that I have already tested something and I have checklist prepared and I always use the same order or more or less the same order, try to find the connected ticket and reuse checklist that you have already prepared. If there is something that you wish to check again, or you know that would require additional checks when developing yet another ticket, you can also already add such relation and make sure that those dots are connected properly. Nowhere to finish. Again, if you go with checklist too deep into details, and it becomes very, again, sky is the limit. You can have very general checks, which tells you nothing, but you can go into super detailed list of checks that would be very formal, would be nice, but again, think whether it will help you actually, again, assess the quality and state of the feature that you have tested. Same with creating to-do lists, same with creating some sort of actions that you need to take. If there is too much tasks and they are too detailed, it's easier to be demotivated of the amount of stuff that you need to follow. If you go too less into details and the checks are too general, same situation, you will probably be demotivated because it's hard to assess, okay, whether it's done, it's ready or not. And do not forget about planning. Like, I'm not going to talk about like test plan in general, as it was already a part of like even previous talk. But lesson learned about the checklist, like based on checklist from this payroll integration that I have showed you, it also nicely showed that we failed planning development of that feature. So once like the whole mess was ended and we organized a post-mortem session, we created yet another checklist, but with stuff that we need to follow each time we plan to introduce such integration, ordered in the chronological way, so it was easy to, okay, we have this, and that sort of like definition of done that should be taken. Another thing that I like doing with checklists is treated it as a part of definition of ready. This is currently the upstream board that we use in our project. So instead of or somehow to translate into practice those idea of three amigos that I showed you in the beginning, before we have a ticket ready for development, it needs to go through this flow. So here we have requirements definition, describing tickets, whatever. And then we have 3 steps of validation. Validation of PO, who defines whether requirements are correct and acceptance criteria are written down as they wish. Dev validation, pure technical, and QA validation. We have agreed within the team that as a part of our process, testing checklists should be an output of this stage. So we cannot take ticket to refinement, we cannot discuss it, we cannot estimate it, if not having such checklist prepared. I'm aware that that process may not be applicable to all teams, depending on the time you have for plan or how time in general you have in your project. If you don't have time for introducing something like that, you can always have booked 1 hour on 2 in the beginning of every sprint and go through the most important tickets that you have or the most complex ones that potentially may take a lot of time to make sure that at least for them you have something designed, if no time for more. Oops, yeah, well, working. Yet another, oh, can you hear me? Okay. Yet another issue with checklists and this hygiene of documentation, it's using templates, but using them wisely. If you decide to add checks to Jira tickets, make sure that they are in one place always. If, yeah. You can even try to play with features that Jira has, so adding some fields if needed, dedicated for that. Currently we use those testing details not only for creating testing checklists, but also to making sure that, okay, we need to prepare some test environment up front, or we need to add some time needed. Oops, okay, I shouldn't touch it. Add some time for preparing devices if it applies to mobile, etc. Again, if you make sure that you create checklists in some clean way, ordered way, the easier later is to follow the flow. And as was also mentioned on a previous talk, when filling the checklist and sort of preparing like test report, do not forget about adding what has not been tested and why. Again, it's a part of the insurance that I already mentioned, but also when you add already what has been skipped and why, and for example you have ticket created that will cover such requirement, you have one check ready. You already know that, okay, I should link those tickets, I should add particular check, so we make sure that the requirement is covered. If not now, then later. So to sum up, if you create checklists in general, both for testing purposes, both for and also for like private purposes only, also, what I would suggest to always have in mind, as usual, needs. You can create brand new checklist that looks like Christmas card, but first think about what's needed in your project, what's like useful for you, but what actually the project as a whole needs. Secondly, think about priorities. Make sure that you address those that are the most important first. Simple as that, and should be like something obvious, but I think sometimes we forget, especially when following some random orders when it comes to testing. Think about capacity of the team, capacity that you have if you support more than one project. Try to adjust somehow with that, and when creating checks and automatically designing time and effort you would need for testing particular feature, also think about how much time you would have for that, and do not forget, okay, highlighting it that I may not have enough time for those and those checks. Again, you can address that later. And remember about risk when creating checks again. Thinking about priorities, remember about what may be risky for your application. It sometimes may be hard for new joiners, sometimes may be hard in the initial state of the project that you are joining, but in general, I think that those 4 items, this is something that we simply should follow as QAs. And actually that was it that I wanted to tell you and share today. Wish you only nicely prepared documentation, just enough. Thanks.
Thank you, Natalia. Any questions to Natalia? Before you go, guys?
All clear.
I guess you covered pretty much everything. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That was very nice. And was thinking that have you tried using mind maps yet for like testing results, test planning and stuff? Because that's something that many people do.
Yes, sometimes I use them, but rather for projects or for designing processes, not exactly to designing tests and planning tests. I prefer this ordering, maybe because I'm biased as an accountant, ex-accountant, who knows. I had to stick to deadlines and some documentation rules. I like mind maps, but rather when I either design or think about new talk and trying to figure out what points I want to cover, or for processes when I want to again connect those dots and areas that would be good to include within the process that I'm trying to define. So for example, for bugs reporting, but also for working within the team, how do we define what we are depending on? Those pictures are easier for me to dress up into mind maps, not necessarily test plans. But if it works for anyone else, again, that's a solution that it works for me, but I'm not trying to say that that's the only right one.
Okay, any more questions?
Hi. To be honest, I have 2 questions. One is how to handle a situation when, let's say we have 2 tasks, both have such a checklist, but the task which will be delivered first will interfere with the second one. And my second question is that you mentioned at the beginning about the new joiners. My question is, where in this approach, what will be the source of the truth? Like, I can imagine that the checklist related to the task might not contain all information for new person to execute the tests correctly. So where to find the beginning?
Starting from the first one, if I have 2 overlapping tasks somehow, I try to agree within the team, and very often it depends again on the situation. We have times that when the first task was affecting the second one, when we were taking those, I was trying to somehow plan or design those checks in parallel, thinking about, again, connections that I have between tickets. We also had times that we were just like waiting with some checks or checking them locally. Again, that's a little bit of flexibility. Don't stick to the checks only, but rather treat it as a guideline. Like I always, when I hear guideline for some documentation for whatever, I always like have Pirates of Caribbean in mind, and that works in most of cases actually. And when it comes to onboarding new joiners, again, it depends. I would use an onboarding checklist as again, guideline, but I would be as a buddy and some person who's supposed to help new joiner to follow, do quick demo based on this checklist that you have. I think it would be more effective to let them play with the app, for example, based on the regression checklist, organize sort of exploratory session, etc. Make it rather flexible and don't stick to tests and details written down only, because new people usually have fresh eye on the product that we are testing. So if they are not biased by tests that we are like repeating many times, they may discover new stuff or have new fresh suggestions to us. So I would combine this regression checklist with demo or exploratory session for QAs from the team.
Okay, thanks. Huge applause once again to Natalia.